This is lesson 12.4, Social Hierarchies. What were the key social hierarchies in Renaissance Europe? And we start with topic 1.1, contextualizing Renaissance and discovery. And we want to explain the context in which the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery developed. But then we've got this other thing, causation. This is kind of like their two bookends, right? In the beginning, you've got context, and in the end, you've got causation, because cause and effect are really two sides of the same coin. Explain the causes and the consequences of the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. European society and experiences of everyday life were increasingly shaped by commercial and agricultural capitalism, notwithstanding the continued existence of medieval social and economic structures. In other words, things were changing, but other things were staying exactly the same. Economic change produced new social patterns, while traditions of hierarchy and status continued. See the dichotomy there between change and continuing? Most Europeans derived their livelihood from agriculture and oriented their lives around the seasons, the village, or the manor, although economic changes began to alter rural production and power. And then we're getting into topic 2.6, the next unit. And it says, explain how economic and intellectual developments from 1450 to 1648, those are two massive bookend years right there, and we'll find out why later on, affected social norms and hierarchies. Established hierarchies of class, religion, and gender continued to define social status and perceptions in rural and urban settings. You've got a comparison there, right? You've got two kinds of settings, rural, out in the country, and then urban, where the city is. The Renaissance and Reformation raised debates about female education and women's roles in the family, the church, and society. So, here we are. We've got an introduction. First of all, what is social anyway? The word social, it's a gray word. It's a fuzzy word. It's cloudy. It's nebulous. When you say social, it's hard to kind of get your head around something concrete and something tangible to think about, a good image in your mind when you think social and social structure. So I'm going to try and clear that up for you. When you're talking about social structure, what you're really talking about is questions like this. Who is better than you? Who is not as good as you? Who is up? Who's down? Who has more power and more advantages? Who has less power and fewer advantages? Who has more education? Who has less education? Who has more money? Who has less? Who has more privileges and benefits? Who has fewer privileges and benefits? Who pays taxes? Who doesn't? Whom does the law favor? Who has special status before the law? And who does not? Whom does the law disfavor? These questions are answered by the idea of social structure. During the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, hierarchies tended to revolve around three main categories: race, class, and gender. And I'm going to let our reading assignments fill you in on most of the race and the class stuff, although we're going to talk about that quite frequently. But this presentation, this one, is going to focus more on the gender issue, specifically as it relates to one very important person, Christine de Pizan. Even though we've been talking about the Renaissance, keep in mind the late Middle Ages are still very much with us. It took a long, long time for the Middle Ages and the structures that were associated with it to fade. If you were a person living in the Middle Ages, you might look around and you might see people observing their stations in life and respecting their betters. In other words, knowing their social position. And this was comforting to the medieval mind. It meant that God was in charge and God was minding things and God was minding the store. God was maintaining the natural order of things and keeping everybody safe and secure and orderly. And it was a top-down arrangement. Humans are not supposed to try to be angels. cats are not supposed to try to chase dogs. There's an order to things. Well, when we talk about race, our textbook makes several important points about race. First of all, the word race in Renaissance Europe was a very fluid word. It could mean lots of different things. It could be used for just about any category of people. You could say the French race, or you could even say the race of educated people. It was a very, very kind of a non-specific word. Well, slavery was an ancient institution in Europe. It went back to well before the Roman Empire. Slavery was in the New Testament. Slaves were often imported into Western Europe from conquered territories. The Mediterranean, that served as an excellent highway for Italian traders from Venice and Genoa to transport slaves westward. Some of these slaves were white. Some of these slaves were black. And Europe was a home to a number of people from Africa throughout the Middle Ages. The Portuguese began systematically exploring Africa around the 1420s, as we will see in much, much, much more detail later. The ultimate goal of all of this exploration was to find a way around Africa and straight to Asia. This is a preview, by the way, of things that we will get into in detail. The Portuguese were also expanding economically. For example, they had already created a plantation system on some territory that they had in the Atlantic Ocean, the Madeira Islands. There was also a demand for labor and a need to finance these explorations. Labor on these plantations, especially if you're growing sugar, which is extremely labor intensive, as we will talk about. And taking people from places that could not put up an effective organized defense against the practice of capturing slaves served both of these needs. That served the demand for labor, and it also served the need to finance explorations. Because the slave trade, and we'll talk about this much, much more, the slave trade was extremely profitable. The church attempted to stop the import of slaves into Europe on Christian moral grounds. That this is just not right. Christians should not be doing this. But the slave trade, it was so lucrative, it was so profitable, you could make so much money that the church simply could not shut it down. The concept of the slave very slowly began to be associated with a specific origin or a specific appearance. And the only thing that was lacking at this point was a racist ideology to enforce the notion that this was how it was supposed to be. Europeans needed a mentality that could explain why it was that if you were a slave, you were most likely black. And if you were black, you were most likely a slave. And that ideology was coming. It was coming very soon. And of course, these African people, they're not Christians, they're pagans. And that means that by capturing them and forcing them to work for nothing and making them your slaves, you're investing in their spiritual welfare. Isn't that nice? Until this ideology takes root, however, this racist ideology, because it hasn't quite yet, you had Africans living in Europe, especially in Portugal. And they were learning marketable skills. Some came as slaves, but were leveraging their way out of slavery. They were settling down in Europe. They were getting married. Sometimes they were marrying other Africans. Sometimes they were intermarrying with Europeans. And thus they were creating a decent-sized communities of people in Europe of African and mixed descent. Some Africans even pursued economic opportunity into other parts of Europe. Queen Elizabeth I even complained about the number of what she called blackamoors, taking domestic jobs from needy, deserving English people. By the 1530s, the large cities of Portugal were about 10% black. And as exploration began to widen Europe's view of the world, and the world became bigger and stranger, there was an increasing curiosity about what was out there, and exotic artifacts from far away became greatly sought after. And if you wanted your friends to see you as wealthy and educated and sophisticated and refined, then you put your exotic things on display. And if you really wanted to wow your friends and your peers and make them green with envy, then you could have a living, breathing, talking exotic person. And look at the painting. Having a brilliant artist like the painter Titian, who we studied last time, capture the moment in a portrait like this one, oh, that's as good as life gets. Doesn't get any better. Well, we will be exploring this topic much, much more as our course progresses. Don't worry. But we move on now to wealth and nobility. As the prominence of the wealthy urban merchant began to spread from northern Italy across the Alps and into northern Europe, ideas about the hierarchy of wealth and privilege began, it's a long process, but began to shift. And we'll talk about this much more. Before the late Middle Ages, you basically had, two classes. You either had nobles, they had land in the country, they had noble titles, they were the social elite, and then you had the commoners, you had the non-nobles, and they were peasants, and they were uneducated, and they were poor. As trade and industry and cities grew, you started to get people who really didn't fit into either of these two social groups. And even towns themselves, the cities, didn't really fit well into the social structure. Towns raised all kinds of questions like, whose authority are these towns under? Who administers and collects the taxes and the dues from these towns? And the first new type of person that the nobility throughout Europe had to deal with was these wealthy, industrious, educated, thanks to the Renaissance, and highly skilled urban merchants. And if you are a noble, such a merchant might be richer than you and might have more income than you, and you're the one who's with the noble title and all the legal privileges. But he's still got more money than you've got. And what do you have that can compete with his education and his skills and his business sense? Well, it turns out that your noble title and the privileges and the status that go with it are highly sought after by these wealthy merchants. Wealthy merchants were eager to marry themselves or marry their children into the nobility. It was also a great way to bring some much-needed cash into a noble family. So this was a two-way street. It was good for both sides of the equation, merchants and nobles. So merchants were also willing to buy their way into the nobility. We've talked about this. They could purchase noble titles, or they could go out and buy rustic rural estates and pretend to be nobles. So often, the nobility was able to do two things with arrangements like this. They were able to absorb some of those wealthy elites into their own family. And they were able to get much needed financial resources into the family in the form of cash and financial assets and business skills. Gender roles, probably the greatest amount of literature that was around at the time, concerned the debates about the character and the nature of women versus men. And this debate went on for centuries. A new literary genre emerged called the Querelle des Femmes, the woman question, or the debate about women. And the printing press, this new invention, fueled this entire genre of literature. And one of its biggest figures was Christine de Pizan. And she actually died just before movable type came out. However, she had a lasting popularity, which the printing press increased and intensified. So the idea that women were intellectually and morally inferior to men was deeply entrenched during this time. Women were considered bad as well as dumber than men. But there had also been prominent writers, male writers, who had challenged this idea. Two big ones, Giovanni Boccaccio and Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales. These guys dedicated entire works to defending the intelligence and the morality of women. And their approach to defending women was something like this. They would take some blatantly misogynistic notion. There are plenty of them. And then they would bombard the reader with the lives and the achievements of women who had proven these notions to be false. But Christine de Pizan did something slightly different. She put a twist on all that. Now, we have an assignment called Documents from Sources, and Documents from Sources 12.5 talks a little bit about Christine de Pizan's life. But it doesn't say why she wrote or what she wrote about. It just gives vague hints. However, we know a lot about Christine de Pizan from her own writings. She put a lot of personal stuff in her writings. She was the first professional female author that we know of. And she was born around 1365 in Italy. Her parents were Italian. So you could say that Christine de Pizan was a Renaissance writer. You could. I would argue that she's more of a medieval writer, more of a late Middle Ages writer. Because Christine de Pizan grew up in France. Her father worked for the French royal court as the court physician and astrologer. And Christine de Pizan witnessed the last three phases of the 100 Years' War. And if you did our summer reading and you experienced the lesson about the 100 Years' War, you know it was in four distinct phases. She lived during three of those phases. So in that sense, you can say she's actually a late Middle Ages author. And the 100 Years' War had a huge impact on her writing. Christine de Pizan's father encouraged her to take her education as far as she possibly could. And Christine de Pizan received much more education than the vast majority of girls, even from wealthy families. And these two things had a big impact on her writing, her father and her education. Christine de Pizan married a minor French nobleman around the age of 15. And her husband and her father both died about 10 years later. And Christine de Pizan's brothers, they moved back to Italy while she stayed in France. And so she was left alone to take care of her mother, her three kids, and one niece. And she was only 25 years old at the time. Writing was actually not the first thing that Christine de Pizan tried in order to make money. Many people owed her husband money, and she had to sue them to get what they owed her. But her husband also had a lot of debts to creditors, and she had to fight off lawsuits from them. And so in order to pay the bills, Christine de Pizan turned to finishing her education and to writing. Christine de Pizan wrote on a very wide range of subjects. She wrote like crazy. She would write on any subject, any genre that was popular reading at the time, as long as it would pay. She needed the money. So she would write poetry. She wrote royal biographies, moral treatises. She wrote a biography of Joan of Arc even before Joan of Arc was dead. She wrote about military theory. This was the 100 Years' War, after all. And Christine de Pizan had a keen interest in artillery, of all things. A lot of people at this time were scrambling to learn all they could about gunpowder and artillery. And they were willing to pay for that knowledge, and so she wrote about it because she needed the money. And Christine de Pizan got the attention of the French royal court, and so she started receiving royal patronage, and remember what patronage is, for her skill at writing. Other authors would even pay her to finish their own works for them. And Christine de Pizan personally oversaw the production and lamination and the translation of all of her own books. She wanted her books to sell, so she wanted them to be quality. The English were also extremely interested in getting their hands on her military books. Well, in 1405, Christine de Pizan published a book called Book of the City of Ladies. She also wrote another book later called Treasure of the City of Ladies, and Treasure was actually more popular at the time. Treasure was a bit more conventional than Book of the City of Ladies, and so today historians tend to find Book of the City of Ladies more interesting than Treasure, because Treasure is just a bit more conventional. In Book of the City of Ladies, Christine de Pizan built on what Boccaccio and Chaucer had already written in defense of women. But she took it further. She also examined why these misogynistic ideas and these prejudices existed in the first place. And Christine de Pizan came to some interesting conclusions about this. Christine de Pizan admitted that she understood why men thought women were intellectually and morally inferior. And she even said that if she were a man, she would probably think the same thing. For example, she admitted that it was logical to conclude that women didn't have the same level of intellect as men. I mean, when you look around, women just didn't have the same intellectual achievements as men. There were no great female theologians or great female doctors or lawyers or philosophers or authors. Women simply had not done as much. But it wasn't because they weren't capable of it. The reason was because they hadn't been given the opportunity. If you could somehow level the playing field, women would hold their own in any intellectual field. So what was creating this illusion that women can't do as much as men? Well, Christine de Pizan said it was the lack of education for women. Universities almost never admitted women. Christine de Pizan also threw fathers under the bus, and she argued that fathers simply don't have the same expectations of their daughters that they have of their sons. And Christine de Pizan, she didn't go all the way with her defense of women. She accepted the idea that there were some things that only men should do, and there were some things that only women should do. I'm not saying, messenger, okay? I'm not saying that we today should accept that. I'm just saying that Christine de Pizan accepted that. And what about moral inferiority? Christine de Pizan was again willing to look at things at first from the male point of view and start there. And she accepted that there were some morally depraved women out there, and men were better off staying away from these women. But suggesting that all women were like this, well, that was just crossing the line. Why did so many male authors disparage women this way? Well, Christine de Pizan had a couple of ideas to answer that. First of all, she said that you have a lot of male authors who just want to show off their learning. There had been lots of great thinkers throughout the ages who had expressed misogynistic views. And these contemporary guys, they just want to show how widely read they were by throwing out all these quotations by history's great misogynistic thinkers. Well, Christine de Pizan was one of the few women in her society with the educational background to see through this kind of agenda and this kind of motivation. Christine de Pizan's second argument about female moral depravity went this way. Those authors who say women should be shunned for moral depravity are, for the most part, old. They're not as attractive anymore. They can't get good dates, so they make themselves feel better by disparaging all women. And by the way, Christine de Pizan was about 40 years old herself when she published this book, so she was not exactly young herself at the time. Christine de Pizan's third argument about female moral depravity went this way. Misogynistic jokes. They do a lot of harm to the image of women. And so Christine de Pizan suggested that all men should completely discard these jokes. These jokes were cruel and they were blasphemous. And so that's it for Social Hierarchies, and I hope this was helpful.